Hello and welcome to Totally Tanked, the podcast all about tanks, except today we're talking armoured fighting vehicles. John.
Hello, yes, I am John. Now, we're not really podcasting because we're not drinking beer today. So, as a result, we're talking about something that some would say is not really a tank. But given that it has tracks and it has armour and it carried weapons, I think it is tanky enough.
It is tanky enough, and it is the most produced armoured fighting vehicle ever. We are talking about the Universal Carrier, also colloquially known as the Bren Gun Carrier or the Bren Carrier.
Sometimes the Cardinal Lloyd Carrier.
Only for real tanky nerds.
Yeah.
I'm Rob, by the way.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's Rob. Now, I mean, I think the problem with the Universal Carrier is partly that the name's a little weird. Like if they'd called it the Scorpion or, something cool, then people would get it. But a classic thing with the British, they give unsexy names to the important things. We will talk later about the Piat. But the Universal Carrier was, in terms of moving troops around the battlefield in World War II, an absolute workhorse used by Australia, Belgium, Canada, China, the Czechs, the French. The Nazis captured a heap at Dunkirk and said, wow, these are amazing, and used them.
The Israelis, the Indonesian...
Japan used them, the ones they captured at Singapore. Greece, the Indians, Irish, Italians, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, the United States, Soviet Union received, nearly 3,000 of them. Thailand, Yugoslavs, New Zealand, then in the post-war period, Afghanistan, Argentina, Biafra, Costa Rica, Egypt, France, Israel, Kuwait, the Federal Republic of Germany had 100 of them. The Netherlands and Switzerland. I don't know if another armoured vehicle has been used by more countries than that, but I'd be surprised.
Yeah, not that I know of, but as we're saying, it's the most produced armoured fighting vehicle ever, so 113,000. So that's a lot of little armoured vehicles running around the place, and watching the videos of them, they just look like good fun to drive.
They look like amazing fun to drive. Now, because we're an audio medium and they're a funny-looking thing, let's try and describe them. So basically, it's a pair of tracks with an open armoured box. That's really kind of it. And sometimes a gun sticking out the front, which can be dismounted. The armoured box looks weird and boxy, but you could fit, I think it was 6 crew inside.
I've seen photos with 11 people carried in this thing. So it's better than walking, but...
Not much, but a bit. So it only do, I think, 40 kilometres an hour.
Almost 50, 48.
Yeah, okay.
And cover 200 k's on road type thing. So it's a tracked vehicle, British design.
1934, first entered service. And, I mean, you can go into a lot of interminable detail about British armoured doctrine into war. And, they had, should they have small groups with lots and lots of armour, or should the whole army be mechanised? And they actually ended up upsetting the armour advocates by mechanising the whole army instead of having specialised armoured groups, which can sound a bit weird, but that's kind of how these things roll sometimes. And so the whole army was shooting around in these little armoured tracked vehicles that you sort of got one sprocket at the front. Anyway, you got a wheel at the front and a wheel at the back, and in the middle you've got a bogey, and the cool thing about it is...
You had one double bogey and one single bogey.
Yeah, but the double bogey, you could move left or right, which would warp the whole track and make the tank turn corners.
Well, that's the thing is that most tanks at that stage, you had your levers and you'd go left track, right track, or whatever else. This one had a steering wheel. It was a right-hand drive because it's British, and you had a steering wheel, and it was basically designed so the same as a Ford truck. So anybody could jump in it and start driving along. It's just where you go. All your common things. Yep, with your bogies, most track vehicles won't have a steering wheel because how do you turn the tracks?
Differential steering of some sort.
But this one, John's statement about the bogies is that it had as you turn the steering wheel, it had a bar that would then shift the bogies out left or right and make you turn slightly, not hard. If you did a hard turn with the steering wheel, it would actually put the brakes on one of the sides of the track so you could make it that hard turn. But
unbelievably hard turn. I mean, there's video out there of them literally turning on their own length, which is 12 feet. 12 feet long.
Yep, just under 4 tons, or maybe 5 tons with fully laden. So they started out as 3 different types of carrier. The first, there was the Bren gun carrier, the Scout carrier, and the cavalry carrier. And those were produced from, as John was saying, from 34 to about 1940. 1940, they said, there's no real point having these 3 different types. We'll just roll the production all into one design, and that's where you got the universal carrier. But the name Bren guns carrier still sticks out because that was the defining feature of what it did. It carried a Bren gun.
And as importantly, it carried the ammunition
for the Bren
gun.
Yes.
Because carrying the ammunition for the machine gun is always a bit of a problem. And on some of them, and in fact most of them, the Bren gun can be mounted, and it looks like it's quite integral to the vehicle, but it was always designed so it could be pulled out and taken forward.
Yeah, so most of the vehicles mounted on this thing could be used in dismounted role. So basically, you picked it up, jumped out of the Bren gun carrier, and you kept on fighting with it in a dismounted role. So it came with a Bren gun, possibly another one mounted on a pintle for anti-aircraft, and the boys anti-tank rifle. Whenever you hear that word, the boys anti-tank rifle, you just think it's a boy's own adventure going out to hunt tanks.
You do, and it's funny with the boys because they remain a byword for a failed weapon system, but in 1939, 1940, 1941...
The light armour you were going up against, you would have taken out pretty much any sort of armoured vehicle.
You were still producing dangerous spalling on even mainline German Panzer IIIs.
Yeah, and that's what the main invasion with France was happening with, was Panzer IIIs. So
and anything smaller, and the battlefield is full of vehicles that aren't tanks, you're really quite a menace.
So for those who don't know, the boys anti-tank rifle is a really long rifle.
Well, I would call it an anti-material rifle today. But
yes, you would. And it's about 0.55 or 13.7 mils or something like that.
Let's talk a little bit about the Bren gun while we're here, because obviously it just about gave its name to the carrier. It's a 303 fully automatic. I think it's a 30-round magazine.
Yep. It's light support weapon for a squad or a platoon. So you can fire it from the hip, you can fire it on the ground, you can even fire it from the shoulder. It was fairly accurate, and with 30 rounds, you weren't going through it quickly. It would just throw out the rounds, bang, 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 bang. Not like a MG42 the Germans had, which would just go through 1,000 rounds in a minute. And basically all the squads, the German squads, were just carrying 1,000 belts of ammunition, whereas for the Bren gun, every squaddy in the platoon had a few magazines of it, and that was it.
Yeah,
it went way down.
It's an interesting contrast because one squad supporting an MG42 definitely lays down a ferocious suppressive fire. I mean, they called it Hitler's chainsaw. But there were definitely recorded cases of individuals caught out in the open who would receive 1,000 rounds fired at them and not be hit. Whereas the Bren gun wasn't particularly suppressive because it would just put bullets where they were being aimed. And then you get into a lot of interesting psychological effects of what actually works better. But a squad of riflemen firing Lee Enfields and supported by a fully automatic... A Bren gun is basically a fully automatic Lee Enfield in some ways. It's a 303 round. All of them extremely accurate on what they're hitting. You're certainly going to use less ammunition to achieve similar effects, which means
you can have longer supply lines. Your squad can carry more ammunition, whereas, as I was saying with the Germans, that they were all weighed down with thousands of rounds of belted ammunition for the MG42, and had to have short supply lines because they would go through the ammo so fast.
Yeah,
these are all considerations when you're looking at these sort of things. Which one's better, and which one's performs its role better, I guess. The Bren gun carrier, you'd rock up in your Bren gun, leap out of the back of it, and start moving forward in a dismounted role as dismounted infantry with your Bren guns firing and advancing on the enemy. Whereas the MG42 is a case of, right, lay down, let out 1,000 rounds, then have to pick it up and re-maneuver around the place.
Now, I just wanted to briefly touch on one of the Germans' favourite ways of using their captured universal carriers.
Yes. Lots of them captured at Dunkirk, some in Norway.
So, to quote Wikipedia here, a total of around 60 Bren No. 2 carriers were converted into demolition vehicles. Carrying a large explosive charge, they would be driven up to enemy positions under remote control and detonated. destroying
control
both
bombs.
themselves and the target.
That's pretty good little use for saying how your radio-controlled vehicle, and away you go, drive it forward, packed with explosives and blow up a bunker or a trench system, and used around the siege of Sevastopol.
Yes, anyway, the Soviets quickly realised they were bad news and used to devote a lot of artillery to any that they saw.
But the Germans also reconfigured them for anti-tank and anti-aircraft fire. So again, just everybody says, "Oh, this is a good little thing. What can we use this for? Carrying stuff and moving stuff around."
Let's talk about some other uses of these vehicles. They could tow the 6-pounder anti-tank gun.
Yep. They weren't designed to tow 6-pounder anti-tank guns, but when people realised that, okay, we need to get this anti-tank gun to this position and it's through lots of mud and an open field and the trucks won't go there carrying the ammo and the tank gun, okay, let's just hook it up to the back of this tracked vehicle and we'll drive it over there. And guess what? It worked. Because soldiers want things that work, and
they're very inconsiderate that way. I mean, but the 6-pounder was a extremely effective anti-tank gun into the late war, and as a package, the carrier could carry a significant amount of ammunition and its crew and get it into position
across any sort of terrain.
Yeah.
Most terrains.
Yeah, difficult terrain.
The Russians didn't like them as much because they couldn't handle deep mud, and they were a little bit cold in the winter because they were open.
Being uncovered, yeah.
I mean, you can put canvas covers over the top of them to keep the sun out, which is good in the desert and everything. But in Russia in winter, it's probably not as nice as having a nice metal roof that you can heat up. Oh, they did have a cooking plate in them, John. So don't worry.
Oh, really?
Portable cooker plate.
Right.
Yeah.
Was that electric or?
I didn't look it up. They just said, look, and there's a portable cooker plate.
I mean, for use in the Western Desert, any flat piece of metal quickly just takes care of business on that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Now, obviously, not obviously, to most of our listeners, and by the way, hello, Austin, you have overtaken San Francisco as our number one destination of listeners. So,
hello, Austin.
Greetings all.
Love your work in the arts sector. You're an inspiration to Texas from my southern eyes.
There you go. Deep southern eyes.
Yeah, deep southern eyes. So keep it up. I think you're a shining beacon of American arts scene in Austin there.
Okay. I was going to say, so the Australian forces in the Western Desert, particularly the Australian 9th Division, were absolute enthusiasts for the carriers. And basically, by the time of Second Battle of El Alamein, I would argue were the best light infantry, mechanised infantry formation in the world. But then when they got recalled to Australia, they were told they couldn't have their carriers anymore and had to retrain as jungle commandos, which seems like a waste of the world's best mechanised infantry.
Yep.
But fundamentally, the British had paid for those carriers and said to Australia, if you're taking those troops home, you're leaving the tanks behind.
And Australia did produce plenty of carriers of our own, and
we didn't let the 9th have them, though.
No. Well, yeah, so they were produced all around the world. So the UK produced plenty. The Canadians, the Americans under license, Australia and New Zealand all had their own setups during World War II to produce them. The fact that New Zealand had produced 22,000 of these things and had them were in New Zealand at the end of the war, thinking,
I imagine New Zealand having built the Bob Semple tank. And for those listeners who aren't aware of the legend of the Bob Semple tank, I would recommend just Googling that at some point. Often considered to be the very worst fighting vehicle ever considered for military use. You haven't seen Bob Semple, Rob?
No, but look, the praying mantis has got to be in there.
The Semple was basically a Caterpillar tractor, like a civilian tractor, with a corrugated iron skin. And some sort of light machine gun sticking out of it.
If we want to get on to crazy, wacky things, we'll do that in a minute. Because the Universal carrier has some of those.
It does indeed. I just want to talk a little bit about Shall we talk about the Piats now, or do you want to?
No, I want to talk about New Zealand and their love of the
of the carrier
and
particularly as a civilian vehicle post-war.
Yeah, so post-war, for those people who don't know, New Zealand's a lovely little country, but full of hills and farmlands, and with all these tractor carriers.
Little tiny farms run by little cranky farmers.
Yeah, but the thing is that they have a lot of geography, as Pratchett fans would say, like the Ramtops. It goes up and down. And so to get up and down, and if you want to take your fencing gear to the top of the hill in order to keep the sheep in, then one of these little universal carriers with its tracks, chuck the fencing gear in the back, up you go, up the hill, ding, 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 you're up the top. And so they're very popular in New Zealand for use on the farm. And New Zealand claiming to have the world record of most active universal carriers going at once, with 27 and running around a track in 2015.
That's got to be post-war.
No, it was like 5 years ago.
No, but I mean, it's the record has to be for the most in operation post-war.
No, in still going.
I've got a picture of the Australian 6th Division with about 50 of them.
Still going is what I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah, whereas beating out the Australians by 10, they were quite proud to say. Australia held the record in 2003.
Yes.
So New Zealand, they've still got 42 in operation over there.
Well, they had a little 4-litre, 4-litre is a big engine, 85 horsepower Ford engine in them.
Yeah, V8.
Which seems like a fair amount of engine, but I guess it's a 5-ton vehicle, so yeah. Okay, so yes, New Zealand, we doff our lids to your universal carrier love. Again, I'm always surprised by how little known such a ubiquitous vehicle was, and I mostly blame Hollywood.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you made a good point about this before. Yep.
So in Hollywood movies, everyone zips around in Jeeps, when the reality was they're in these weird little track vehicles with the boxy sides.
Jeep's much more easy to film, because that way the stars can have their helmets off and be seen very easily, like convertibles in. But
that probably is the main thing, is that the hero can sit next to the driver and be clearly visible to the cameras, whereas to the cameras in a carrier, they're sort of sitting in a weird box.
Heads all covered over with armour in front of them, but unless you've got the camera mounted right on top.
Now, other uses of the carrier were as a mortar carrier. Now, Rob, you're a bit of a mortar enthusiast.
Oh, yes. So the Australians built a 3-inch mortar carrier version. Most of them could take a 2-inch mortar. So, again, just a squad or platoon mortar type activity. Short range, provide indirect fire, can be mounted in any sort of carrier. The Australians built a 3-inch version, which is more of a company level support weapon.
It's going to be a decent piece of artillery, though.
Basically you're looking at 5 to 6 Ks of use out of it, rather than 1,200 metres.
Yeah, and you won't hit a moving target deliberately with a mortar.
But if you've got they're a support vehicle, so you drive them up as your infantry, you're moving forward, and you can suddenly lay down, rather than having to, again, you've got your tracked vehicle bringing up indirect fire support directly into an attack, so you can drive up to support them and then start laying down mortar rounds. And again, you're carrying ammunition rather than having to lug around a piece of tube and lots of ammo.
Yeah, but the point being that if you have coordinates on the map that you would like to cease to exist, then, I mean, obviously one 3-inch mortar is not going to wipe out a grid square, but you start firing them into that location, you're going to really start upsetting the enemy.
They don't go around as one; they go around as a section. So you'd have three mortars in a mortar section, and they just start laying down fire and just be covering a 50 by 50 area, suppressing that, so that your infantry can then advance on an attack through that area.
Now, I think this is going to bring us to the Piat.
It is. So the Piat, for those who don't know, is a spring. But not spring-loaded. No, what was the word?
It's a spigot mortar.
Spigot mortar.
Now, it did have a spring-loaded trigger mechanism, which has led some people who are wrong to think that it was some sort of like spring-powered crossbow attachment. But there was actually an explosive charge. So a spigot mortar is when you've got a hollow stick, and then you've got a big bulbous warhead on the end of it. And there's you put the hollow stick over another stick, and then there's something goes bang, and it forces the tube, a bit like skyrockets that have similar arrangements, to shoot off the stick and fire in a general direction. It's not a particularly accurate way of doing things, but it does let you move quite large warheads, not at tremendous speed, but fast enough to get where they need to go. Yeah. And in the case of a shaped charge, which the Piat had, now Piat, P-I-A-T, stands for, I think, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank.
Because it was an infantry anti-tank weapon. So prior to the British version of bazookas, but prior to the bazookas, because they needed something that could fire from cover, could take out German armour, and was light enough to go with an infantry squad.
And because it had a shaped charge warhead, and we have talked in one of our earlier episodes about the Monroe effect, and basically we're talking about a copper cone that is facing, the point of the cone is facing back towards the operator, and then when it hits the target, the explosive around the copper cone forces it inside out and through whatever it's hitting, and then a physical effect called the Monroe effect creates a high-powered jet of essentially plasmarized copper, and it cuts through metal like
really fast.
Would not believe.
Yeah. And then it spurts around on the inside of an armoured vehicle, killing everybody inside it.
Yeah. Now, just before we came on to record this, we actually watched, if you go onto YouTube and search for slow-mo guys, shaped charge, and about 10 minutes in, they use a very tiny little shaped charge to blast through a safe door. And the terrifying thing is when they show it at full speed, it's just a popping noise, and then there's a hole in the water bucket they had on the other side. But if you watch it at super slow motion, it's like the fist of God slamming through this safe door and into the water bucket.
A tiny little 1-inch hole, and then with great big effects on the other side. Yeah. Yep. Gavin Free, also based in Austin these days, so thank you, Austin, for looking after him.
Maybe he's a fan. So the point with the Piat is that it's firing a reasonably size-shaped charge, and I might add modern anti-tank weapons like the Russian RPG series also use shaped charge warheads. That's why they look like pineapples to accommodate the copper cone. So we would sort of plop out on this spigot mortar launch and hit the side of the tank at a speed that doesn't have to be particularly high as long as it gets to the side of the tank it's shooting at. And then the warhead creates this terrifying jet into the inside of the tank, which then does horrible things to any human beings that happen to be inside.
Yeah. So the benefits of the Piat was, as I was saying before, can be fired from a lying position or behind cover because there was no great big discharge of backblast rocket firing or out the front. It was just a case of the projectile ran zip forward and hit the side of the vehicle, and then it would make a great big mess on the inside of the vehicle. So it was used by the British in all sorts of scenarios for that. But the Canadians came up with a wonderful idea of saying, you know what, one of these things is good. How about we load up 14 to the back of a universal carrier and then set them all off at once? What would that look like?
I'm not sure if it was actually an effective use of a Piat, but if you happen to be on the receiving end of it, it would not make your day very happy. Now, even though they were funny looking things, and even though people to this day still think it was just some sort of spring fired mechanism, the effective range was considered to be 100 yards, which people often underestimate just how far that is. And it did have a maximum firing range out to 350 yards, although you were not likely to hit anything at that sort of distance.
Unless you had 14 of them strapped to the back of your universal carrier.
Well, you're more likely to hit something, yeah. The other thing they were really good at was giving them to resistance forces. Because you could drop a bunch of them from the back of a plane, and if hopefully the right people would pick it up. And
very useful in cities, yes, against armoured vehicles.
Yeah, and again, you could hide in wait. Whereas people
and it didn't give you away your position by having a great big flame jetting out the back or front of it.
Yeah, and also people talk about particularly Panzerfausts, and Americans obviously fraught about their bazookas. But both of these weapons, you have to stand up in front of a deadly engine of enemy death and fire it, giving away your position, and then hoping you'll live long enough to see if it has any effect. Whereas a Piat, you could fire from a cellar and they would never know you were there until the fist of God comes slamming through the side of your vehicle. Obviously, when it's used on a carrier, normally it's probably to be dismounted and, again, fired from a hidden position. But a very effective and nasty little weapon to to have in your vehicle if you do come around a corner and find yourself facing something unpleasant.
Now, other weapon versions of the Universal Carrier, the Canadians also built a flamethrower version because why not?
Why not?
So, yes, they made about 1,000 flamethrower versions, the Wasps, and they could run around and burn out bunkers or anything else and came in front of them. There was plenty of anti-aircraft versions, just by mounting your Bren gun on the back of it. The Australians liked putting Vickers machine guns in the front of theirs, and because the Vickers is a water-cooled machine gun, you could use it. It was mounted, so it couldn't be dismounted, but it was, as I was saying, a water-cooled gun, so it could be fire longer and work in hot environments. So much more effective than other medium machine guns that would overheat and stop working in hot environments, or after need the barrels changed out or whatever else.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. Australian military in World War II had a real interest in water-cooled machine guns, and it's almost certainly because of the fact it's just hot here, and we tend to send our soldiers to hot places. And they can fire longer in hot environments, whereas if you're planning to fight in the snow in Northern Europe, it's less of a concern. One day we will do the Australian Sentinel, which is famous for what's called the appendage, which looks like a giant dong out the front of the tank.
It does.
But was actually an armoured water cooling system for a Vickers machine gun. Which, once you put an armoured cowl on a water-cooled machine gun, it's only one thing it's going to end up looking like.
Yeah. Other versions, again, the Australians came up with, there was a 2-pounder anti-tank version.
Now, that's a tank at that point, isn't it?
Which is not really. It's more of a tank hunter. It's an anti-tank.
Yeah. The 2-pounder cannon was a genuine tank armament, though. It wasn't. This isn't just some infantry piece being lugged around.
Bodged on. But again, they found some issues with it because they had to mount the engine in the front. It became front heavy, and it was just out of balance. It wasn't as effective as the other versions of it. But again, Australia came up with a lot of different versions that didn't quite work. The local production version 1, nobody really liked that, and so they didn't work. We had a bunch bombed in Darwin Harbour, so the local production 2 versions had been shipped up to Darwin for use by the Australian forces there at the beginning of the war, and when the Japanese bombed Darwin in December of 1941, they sank the USAT Megs, which had a bunch of universal carriers, Australian-produced universal carriers in harbour, and so they all went to the bottom of Darwin Harbour. Again, other differences for the Australian version is we had levers in ours rather than a steering wheel, because they couldn't be bothered doing the bogey turning activities, so they just did track turning.
Yeah. I just want to talk about a German variant that's caught my eye here.
Yeah?
It's the Panzerjäger Bren 731E. So I love that the Germans are calling it a Bren carrier.
Yep.
Even though it's not meant to be called a Bren carrier. Obviously the Germans, no respecters of English nomenclature. Anyway, and that carried a triple Panzerschreck transport rack.
So they didn't fire it from the back of the vehicle, but they would carry it.
They would carry it, and it was intended as a tank-destroying unit. But just Panzerjäger Bren on the move. You wonder what the English signals intelligence were making of that one. And then I think they finally left operational service in the 1980s. I strongly suspect if anyone had kept making them, other people would have liked to keep operating them longer, just because they're such useful, easy to maintain.
Well, one of the other vehicles we're looking at doing for today was the M548 carrier, which is basically the next version of the Universal Carrier. It was in Australia, they called it Tilly as a utility vehicle, and basically it was the light-skinned tracked vehicle for carrying around stuff, built from the 1960s onwards by the US, and so Australia got them all from Vietnam through the Vietnam era, and they were used up and through till the 90s. I remember when I was up in Darwin, we had a couple of them sitting out the back that we had to keep on counting, but never actually used.
I'm also going to go on a limb here and say that in many ways the Bren, in its operational use, was the predecessor to the technical of today. Now, your Toyota four-wheel drives have gotten better at cross-country coverage than wheeled vehicles were in 1934.
Yep.
But the basic idea that you want your guys in something that can go cross-country and you want to carry around 6 of them and you want it to also carry some sort of medium-weight weapon to support them. Technical as being used in Syria or by Chad, in the Toyota War, is largely being used in a very similar way to the way the Bren was used in World War II. Or the Universal Carrier, sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Although I'm sure the Jeep enthusiasts will claim that they were the real inspiration, but we know they're wrong.
Now, we have to talk about the rocket leaping version.
Okay, tell us about the rocket leaping version.
Because you've never heard of something until you've decided, okay, what our little tracked person vehicle carrier needs is to strap 6 rockets onto the outside of it so it can leap over gaps. All right? So that's what they did.
You just know they'd have done this to a tank that could have done it, but they had to get something that was under 5 tons to get the rockets to do any good, right?
So they strapped 6 rockets to the outside of it and said, okay, this will go really well. We'll be able to jump over cliffs like streams and rivers and whatever else and minefields and get to the other side safely. So they set it off and it did not go well. Luckily enough, there was nobody in it because, but the fact that they decided to try this of saying, yep, we'll be able to leap over things in a universal carrier with troops in it to get over a minefield.
I mean, I've seen science fiction designs for troop carriers of the future, built on hovercraft stuff. That it's always like, and it'll be able to leap up into the air if it has to. And it's, so this is a long-held dream of the leaping personnel carrier. Obstacles will be as nothing.
No, it did not go well. But I just love that they tried it. And one guy, he built himself what's called the praying mantis. All right, so again, they've got it at the Bovington.
There were a lot of bad ideas
because they had so many of them. So everybody comes up with it. So they've got the praying mantis at the Bovington Tank Museum, and what this is essentially, rather than just have a machine gun in it, this guy built a little chamber for the gunner and the driver to climb into this tube, and the tube would raise itself up 12 feet in the air with these guys inside the tube, and at the top of the tube would be a pair of machine guns on a turret, and then the gunner could then fire the machine guns from inside this armoured tube from a height of 12 feet, so being able to shoot over walls or bocages in the lowlands or any other sort of obstacle, while the hull of the tank, the hull of the universal carrier stayed hull down and out of sight of any enemy fire.
Now let's go through the problems with this concept, shall we? So firstly, we've basically doubled the weight of our vehicle. Secondly, it's only useful in the peculiar situation that you find yourself on one side of a wall and the enemy is on the other side of the wall. Thirdly, you cannot armour it particularly heavily because you still have to elevate the whole thing, and then you're putting 2 crew people in a very exposed position from which they are going to try and rain death on the enemy before the enemy rains death back at them. And they're stuck inside a
tube, basically.
Yeah.
It's not... But again, they...
In fact, it's a way to lose cover. You're there happily with cover,
yep.
And then you expose yourself to the enemy with a huge weight penalty. So it's one of those things where it's always really boring when military people start talking about wanting to develop concepts of operation before they actually try and do technical requirements.
Yeah. Well, you've got to come up with your concepts and then figure out can the technology actually support your concept? And
true, but in this case, there was no concept of operations. They were just like, look, we can build a tube and hoist people into the air. Oh, give them some machine guns. It'll be great. Without, doing all the boring thinking, I hate doing boring thinking, so I'm all for just doing something exciting, but, yeah.
I'm much more of a functional type thinking myself and thinking, no, I don't think that's going to work, guys.
Is there anything better we can do with our time and energy? Yes. What a wonderful time wars can be for those who get to be in the back areas making bad ideas. Yes, there's a lesson in there somewhere. So I think that's all we really have to say on the Universal Carrier. No beer review because we're not doing a proper tank.
No, we've pushed the Italians back another couple of weeks because, well, the Italians, we're always pushing them to the back of
They're
the queue.
always late.
Yeah. But thing to say about the Universal Carrier, right? It was used by everyone, used for everything. It had lots of issues, but it still was better than walking, and it was functional for it. Whatever you tried to do with it, right? It would do it. But yeah, it's not. And there were so many of them.
And when you envisage armies on the move in the Second World War, almost all of them were actually scooting around in these weird little track vehicles. Yeah. And certainly if you think of a British or Commonwealth army, they were definitely moving around in these funny vehicles. So, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for listening. We will be back probably in the next couple of weeks with an Italian tank.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Good night.